Good evening. I want to congratulate Richard Laird for organizing such a fascinating conference. I regret that I can't join you in person. As I explained to Richard, the reason I needed to stay back in Princeton is that I'm attending a memorial service for our mutual friend Bill Bowen, who passed away last month. Bill Bowen, as many of you surely know, made many contributions, including helping Princeton University to go co-ed, his work on labor supply. He is the creator of JSTOR. He also led a study on the effects of college attendance and diversity. And I recall a meeting he had 15 years ago where he assembled a group of economists and psychologists and other social scientists to help him design the questionnaire. And he said he was looking for ways to measure success, life outcomes, other than income. Are there any ways to do that? And there was a long pause, and then my friend David Card said, well, we could use the logarithm of income. And Bill thought that was a helpful suggestion, but he wanted to go further. And on that survey, the College and Beyond survey, were several questions about subjective well-being that have helped, I think, to provide a fuller evaluation of people's college experiences. What I'd like to do this afternoon is describe some recent work I've been doing trying to use subjective measures to better understand trends in labor force participation, then make some wildly speculative connection between those findings and the rather shocking election results in the U.S. last month, and then conclude by describing some of the more conventional applications of subjective well-being to public policy, which I consider to be quite promising. Labor force participation, as you know, has been declining in the U.S. and many countries around the world. For men in the U.S., the labor force participation rate has been declining since the late 1940s, and only about 88% of prime working age men are in the labor force today in the U.S. That is the second lowest in the OECD. Only Italy has a lower labor force participation rate. Now, in the project I'm going to describe, I looked at labor force participation of young people. I had fun looking at the hypothesis about video game playing and whether video games are a distraction from going to school and work, and are they really more fun than watching TV? The short answer is yes. But I won't go into that work because I think the key issue is prime age men. I also looked at prime age women who present a different set of challenges when it comes to labor force participation. Women who are not in the labor force, however, look like they're quite content with their lives by and large, in part, I think, because many women who are not in the labor force are taking care of family responsibilities, and they have much meaning in their lives. If one looks at women who are out of the labor force for other reasons, they seem to be just as discontent as the men as a whole. So I don't want to give that short shrift, but the men who are not in the labor force are prime age men are really, in some sense, uniquely unhappy in the U.S. So that's why I'll concentrate on that group, and that's something I learned in the process of this research. It's also worth noting that the decline in labor force participation in the U.S. Is a fairly broad phenomenon. It has declined almost as much for white men as it has for men as a whole. And it's declined more for white men with lower education than it has for white men as a whole. And that in particular is the group that was particularly supportive of Donald Trump in the most recent election, which is, I think, one reason to try to understand the conditions of this group. So I have a couple of charts I could show you. The first one is just overall labor force participation rate of men aged 25 to 54. And you can see that that's been declining since as long as the BLS has been collecting data, from 1948, when it was around 97%, to most recently in October of this year, where it was down to 88.5%. There's been a little bit of a recovery in the past year, but I think that's more a blip. The next chart shows you, if you look at white prime age men, labor force participation data begin in 1954 for this group, and it's been declining rather continuously. And if you look at participation for white prime age men with a high school degree or less, it's lower and also has been declining at a sharper rate. Now, one of the things I found is this group reports very poor health. 43% of men who are out of the labor force, age 25 to 54, report that they are in poor or fair health. That compares to 12% for employed men. That compares to 15% for unemployed men. So in terms of their self-reported health, this is a group that doesn't feel very healthy, men who are out of the labor force. And they also report worse self-rated health than do prime age women who are out of the labor force. Many of these men also report having functional disability. 34% report that they have some type of a severe disability, such as being blind or having severe difficulty seeing, being deaf or having severe difficulty hearing. Nearly 1 in 6 prime age men who are out of the labor force report that they have difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. And 1 in 5 reports that they have difficulty walking or climbing stairs. These facts led me to look at their self-reported experiences during the course of the day, and in particular, how much pain did they feel. And here the results were really striking. If you look at prime age men who are out of the labor force as a whole, they spend 52% of their time where they say they have some positive level of pain. That's 2.5 times or 2 times the rate for men who are in the labor force. And we also asked in the American Time Use Survey Wellbeing module individuals if they took pain medication on the previous day. 44% of prime age men who are out of the labor force said that they took pain medication on the previous day, over double the rate for employed men or unemployed men. Now, we didn't know from the American Time Use Survey what type of pain medication these individuals took. If they took an aspirin, well, that's not such a big deal. If they took narcotics, opioid pain medication, that's of more concern. So to learn more about what type of pain medication people had in mind in answering these questions, I did a follow-up survey. And this slide summarizes the follow-up survey. I did a survey of 571 men who are not in the labor force, age 25 to 54, and asked them the exact same question from the American Time Use Survey. Yesterday, did you take pain medication such as aspirin, ibuprofen, or prescription pain medication? 47% of this group said yes, they took pain medication on the previous day, very close to what one finds with the American Time Use Survey. 65% of those who took pain medication said they took a prescription drug. So by and large, the way people are answering this question is they interpret pain medication as prescription medication. 40% said yes, pain prevents them from accepting a full-time job for which they are qualified. So at least in their minds, many of them in their minds, pain prohibits them from working. And I should be clear, this is 40% of the whole group of men who are not in the labor force. In my sample, 66% reported a severe disability. I used a broader definition of disability than the BLS. I allowed people to write in other. People wrote in other conditions like diabetes or cancer. And 35% of this group reported that they received disability insurance. So it's a very interesting question, important question, how these people are supporting themselves. If you look at white prime-age men who have less than a college degree and are out of the labor force, this is a group that we'll focus on again in a moment in terms of the U.S. election, 50% of this group, 50.3% of white prime-age men with less than a college degree who are not in the labor force take pain medication on a daily basis. And again, about 2/3 of the pain medication is prescription medication. Well, what about the subjective well-being of this group? We have two measures from the American Time Use Well-Being Survey. We have experienced well-being, how people reported their happiness or sadness or stress, whether their activities were meaningful during the course of the day, and also the Cantril ladder. The Cantril ladder asks people to imagine a ladder of the best possible life, where a 10 is the best possible life for you, and a 0 is the worst possible life, and what step of the ladder do you fall on? So this table shows you both the experienced well-being and the Cantril ladder broken down by labor force status. And you can see very large differences in both measures of well-being by labor force status. In terms of emotional well-being, prime-age men who are not in the labor force report the lowest levels of emotional well-being. Danny Kahneman and I developed an overall summary measure called the U index, which is the fraction of time people spend where their strongest emotion is a negative one. If we calculate the U index for these groups, the U index is 22% for prime-age men who are not in the labor force versus 17% for unemployed men and 14% for employed men. So in terms of the U index, which, by the way, does not include pain, this is comparing stress and sadness to happiness, the men who are out of the labor force look like they are the most unhappy, most miserable group. Interestingly, when we look at younger workers, we find just the opposite, that the group that's out of the labor force looks quite happy. And that's because many of them are enrolled in school and going to many parties, I presume. In terms of the Cantril ladder, the rankings are more like what we're accustomed to seeing, where the unemployed look like they're the most discontent with their lives, although the men who are out of the labor force are not too far behind. This next chart that I have compares the Cantril ladder for men and women by labor force status. And what you can see, if you look at men first, the employed men look like they are most content with their lives. The horizontal axis here is inverted, so it starts with 10 and then goes down. So it starts with the highest step on the ladder and then declines. And you can see that the distribution for employed men totally dominates the distribution for men who are not in the labor force and for unemployed men. And the unemployed men and the not in labor force men have pretty similar distribution across the ladder of life. If we look at women, the pattern is different. If we look at women, women who are out of the labor force look quite similar to employed women. We find the same thing in terms of their emotional well-being. If, however, we drop from the sample women who say that they're out of the labor force because they're taking care of their house, the women look a lot like the men. They look like they're dissatisfied with their lives if they're out of the labor force. So I think that's an important observation when it comes to looking at women. Let me move to the more speculative part of my talk and try to draw some connections between subjective well-being and the U.S. election. I think this is related to policy because the election of Donald Trump will lead to the, in my view, most severe policy reversals in at least recent American history. There's been a lot written already about the role of the white working class in the election. And I wanted to just bring some of this to your attention and perhaps connect it to what I've been finding about labor force participation, high use of pain medication for white men who are less educated and out of the labor force. So let me quickly review some of this. Jeff Guo, who is an interesting journalist for the Wonk blog for the Washington Post, has actually published some regressions and some interesting charts on these issues. So let me show you one chart where he looks at the Rust Belt, which was responsible for Mr. Trump's election in the Electoral College. I also like to point out that Hillary Clinton won the general election by about 2.8 million votes, but holding that aside, it was clearly the case that less educated white men overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump. And what these graphs show you is for each state, looking at the counties in each state, they relate the fraction of people in the county 25 and over who lack a bachelor's degree, below college education, and are white. So some of the counties, had 75, 80% of the population was white and had less than a college degree. Other counties had 5% of the population in that category. On the vertical axis is Donald Trump's margin over Mitt Romney's margin in that same county. So kind of a way of controlling for a lot of other characteristics of the county. And what you can see is Donald Trump outperformed Mitt Romney by wide margins in counties that were overwhelmingly white and less educated. I have to give Jeff Kuo credit because he was onto these issues early on. During the Republican primaries, he looked at the death rate among non-Hispanic whites age 40 to 64 and related that to Donald Trump's margin in the county. And you can see that counties that have higher death rates were more likely to have supported Mr. Trump. And Kuo wrote the following: "We still don't know what exactly is causing middle-aged white deaths to rise, but it seems that Donald Trump has adeptly channeled this white suffering into political support. Understanding why this part of America is so unhappy, why some white people are literally dying faster, may help explain how Trump became such a powerful force in this election." Now, one reason why the death rate for whites in that age group has increased, as my colleagues Ann Case and Angus Deaton have emphasized, is because of overdoses from opioid medication, suicides, and so on. This next chart shows you the remarkable pattern of deaths due to opioid pain relievers or heroin or cocaine or marijuana. And if you look from 1999 to 2013, the rate of death due to overdose from opioid pain medication tripled. Went up 200% from under 5,000 a year to over 15,000 a year. And others have begun to try to link this pattern with support for Donald Trump. Let me show you one interesting scatter diagram from a study by Shannon Monat, a sociologist at Penn State. She looked at some of the key swing states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, again at Donald Trump's margin over Mitt Romney. And she related that to the age-adjusted death rate from drug, alcohol, and suicide, and finds a correlation of 0.4. In multiple regressions, these results tend to hold up. Now, these variables are all pretty highly correlated, but what the regressions are telling us is that low education matters more than income, for example. So the fact that less educated whites also have had low income was not the driving force, at least as far as these regressions are concerned. So I think this is all in the realm of speculation, looking at these patterns, and I'm sure there will be much more research in this area in the future, but it does suggest that subjective well-being focused on groups with very low levels of well-being, such as less educated white men who are out of the labor force, can be very important when it comes to elections. Let me conclude by talking about more routine policy applications, and I wanted to highlight four. First, valuing non-monetary benefits and costs in a benefit cost analysis. In government, it's quite standard to do benefit cost analysis, but there are many benefits and costs that are hard to quantify, certainly hard to put dollar signs on, and subjective well-being measures can be informative there. Second, subjective well-being measures have become an important outcome measure in program evaluation studies and in field experiments, and I could describe a few here for you. The Moving to Opportunities experiment in the U.S., which gave people vouchers, randomly selected households to receive vouchers to move out of public housing, research by Jens Ludwig and others have found that subjective measures of mental health improved much more than objective measures such as employment or income, which is not so surprising since people wanted to move mainly to move to safer neighborhoods, and that was reflected in the subjective measures before results were found in objective measures. A study by Johannes Haushofer and others looked at an unconditional cash transfer program in Kenya where households were randomly selected to receive cash. They were surveyed on both experienced well-being and evaluative well-being. I'm involved in a large-scale follow-up experiment in Kenya as well. And what this study has found was that the measures of subjective well-being improved for the treatment group that received the cash transfer, and the measures of subjective well-being declined for the control group because they saw their neighbors doing better than they were. So relative income mattered and affected their subjective well-being. Another study by Esther Duflo and co-authors in Morocco looked at the effect of connecting water pipelines to individuals' houses and found effects on improvements in their subjective well-being. They were able to spend more time with family as well, which probably led to higher subjective well-being, although they did not find objective changes such as improvements in health. Third area, this is, I believe, what David Halpern calls de-shrouding, providing information on the distribution of subjective well-being across occupations, across cities, across educational majors, and so on. This information can be useful for people to make choices. And finally, tracking societal progress. I think that the work that ONS has done to come up with overall measures of societal progress can provide an extremely valuable complement to economic indicators. So let me conclude where Richard Laird really asked me to start, which is to make some personal reflections on the use of subjective well-being in policy. First, I think it's important to bear in mind all of the caveats that are necessary when it comes to policy research, and then some additional ones that are specific to subjective well-being. For example, the fact that groups can interpret subjective well-being scales differently, the fact that tastes vary, the fact that people sort based on their preferences, the fact that causality is difficult to infer. All of those caveats, I think, need to be borne in mind, and research designs and analysis needs to be done to try to overcome those issues. That said, I think there's been tremendous progress in the policy realm when it comes to using subjective well-being measures. I think much of this has been sparked by several commissions. I personally have been a member of 5 commissions, beginning with the Sarkozy Commission, to evaluate and make recommendations to governments on the use of subjective well-being and the measurement of subjective well-being, and I think that's a lot of progress. I'm particularly optimistic about the opportunity to combine subjective measures with objective measures. For example, subjective reporting on pain and health combined with use of pain medication to try to generate a more comprehensive picture of the well-being of a different group, and also to generate some hypotheses about interventions that could help to raise subjective well-being. For example, I think my work suggests that physical therapy or pain management can have beneficial effects, particularly for groups that are out of the labor force. When I thought about uses of subjective well-being when I was in the government and how we may have come up with different policies because of research on subjective well-being, I have to say that I couldn't think of too many. I think that's in part because during my time in the government, I was overwhelmed with fighting the Great Recession, and it was clear that ending the recession, preventing massive bank failures, and enabling families to stay in their homes would be good for the economy and good for their subjective well-being. But there were a couple of instances where I think the research did help to inform us and lead to better policy. For example, investment in infrastructure. Well, of course, we think about the effect of infrastructure on productivity, and we think about the effect of infrastructure investment in putting construction workers back to work. But I also thought about research that Danny Kahneman and I had done, which found that people were most unhappy when they were commuting to work, back and forth to work. So if we can improve mass transit, if we can improve the experience of commuting, I thought that had benefits beyond the economic benefits that we had quantified. And in that regard, the Office of Management and Budget issued directions that non-monetary benefits and costs should be enumerated and quantified in benefit cost analyses, and I think that's very much in keeping with this idea. Then finally, during the entire time I spent in the government, really beginning with my time at the U.S. Labor Department in the mid-1990s, I thought that the government does not do enough to survey and evaluate the experience and subjective well-being of its customers, of its citizens. And when you go to the motor vehicles department, you're not handed a survey the way Netflix surveys your views on movies, or Air France surveyed my view a couple of weeks ago on the quality of my air flight. The private sector, I think, is very much ahead of the public sector in this regard in terms of collecting information on customer satisfaction and trying to use this to improve their customers' experiences. It may be because the government has a monopoly position, but I think that there would be many benefits from having the government catch up to the private sector in this regard and try to collect information on citizens' interactions with government programs, their experiences with the services that government provides, and I think that would yield very valuable information so we don't have to wait for an election to try to infer what it is that's motivating the population. Thank you very much.